You all know Nintendo, right? But how much do you actually know about its history? And I'm not just talking about Super Mario or Zelda. Nintendo's story goes way back, long before game consoles. Card games, betrayals, wars. Yes, all of these are part of Nintendo's journey. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the lesser-known facts about Nintendo's past. If you're ready, let's get started. To tell the story of this gaming giant, we first need to travel back in time, back to the days when Japan was still ruled by an empire. It all begins with Nintendo's founder, Fusajiro Yamauchi. Fusajiro first founded Nintendo in 1889 under the name Nintendo Koppai, and the main business was producing handmade playing cards. The word Nintendo in Japanese means leave luck to heaven, while Koppai was used to refer to playing cards. These cards could be used to play several different games, much like modern playing cards. However, Nintendo also introduced a game called Hanafuda, which was played with these cards. At that time, the sale and playing of cards were banned in Japan. This was due to Japan's isolation from the rest of the world, as the country sought to distance itself from foreign influences. Another reason was the widespread gambling problem in Japan. The imperial government believed that card games were causing social and economic harm to the country, and thus decided to prohibit them. Seeing that no one else was entering this market, Fusajiro Yamauchi saw it as an opportunity. Instead of numbers, the Hanafuda cards featured flowers. Because of this, they were viewed as a work of art rather than illegal gambling cards, and the imperial government approved their sale. Fusajiro Yamauchi handcrafted, painted, and packaged these cards himself. In a short time, demand for the cards grew so much that the company had to hire many people to start mass production. With the onset of World War II, things became quite difficult for Nintendo. Already a small-scale company, Nintendo was heavily impacted by the devastation in Japan at the end of the war and shrunk even further. By then, there wasn't much left of the company. At this point, the task of gathering what was left and reviving the company fell to 21-year-old Hiroshi Yamauchi. From the very beginning, Hiroshi believed it was his destiny to make his ancestors proud and turn Nintendo into a globally recognized name. He also knew that for this to happen, the company needed to innovate. However, the company's employees were very resistant to change and held on to traditional thinking. They strongly opposed the innovations Hiroshi proposed, as they believed he was too young and not mature enough to run the company. Because of this, when he took over, he didn't immediately implement any major changes, instead continuing the family's core business of producing playing cards. Hiroshi had an innovative spirit. He just needed a bit of courage. He would find the courage he needed from Japan itself, which was rapidly recovering, renewing, and developing after the wounds of World War II. By the 1950s, Hiroshi had traveled to the United States, where he was about to make the most important decision of his life. There, he saw how popular Disney characters had become and decided to collaborate with Disney. This move signified that the company was no longer just catering to gamblers and serious card players. Nintendo now had a broader audience, children and families. If Hiroshi wanted Nintendo to become a bigger company, it needed to globalize. Additionally, the company had to expand beyond just playing cards and venture into different products and industries. For this reason, Hiroshi removed the word Koppai from the company name and changed it to Nintendo. While entering different countries and industries seemed logical in theory, the execution was a disaster. In 1960, Hiroshi tried just about everything. He was involved in the toy market while also making investments in areas such as television, taxi services, and hospitality in an effort to grow. However, none of these side ventures led Nintendo to the success it aimed for. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Hiroshi learned an important lesson from this and decided not to disrupt the company's core foundation. Nintendo was in the business of games, and it needed to continue in that direction. After the collaboration with Disney, Nintendo once again needed a groundbreaking idea. One day, while Hiroshi was walking through the factory, stressed and thinking about what Nintendo's next product would be, he noticed a worker using a plastic mechanism to reach items on the higher shelves. Hiroshi was fascinated by this and decided to produce it. He named this product the Ultra Hand. After the collaboration with Disney, Nintendo achieved its second market success by producing these plastic grabbers that allowed children to reach for things from high places. The product became quite popular among kids. However, this success was nothing compared to what the company would achieve in the future. Time passed, but Hiroshi's thoughts never stopped. He wanted a new product. In the late 1960s, Hiroshi was traveling on Japan's bullet train when he noticed a businessman next to him passing the time with an electronic calculator. This inspired Hiroshi's next idea, a portable game that only required watch batteries to operate. By the 1970s, Nintendo introduced the Game & Watch. The Game & Watch devices, Nintendo's first game consoles, were a big hit among young people. Hiroshi was very pleased with this and could see that there was a gap in the gaming market. He decided to focus all his energy on arcade games, as he believed the future lay in video game design. However, there was a problem. He had no expertise in this field and had not received any training in video game design. He couldn't handle this on his own. So he directed the company's resources toward hiring video game designers. He brought many engineers into the company, and during this process, Nintendo produced several highly successful video games. Successful games like The Legend of Zelda, Kid Icarus, and Metroid were produced during this period. In Japan, Nintendo's games became the most played in arcades, but over time, the Japanese market began to feel insufficient for Hiroshi. He wanted to expand into foreign markets, but this would not be an easy task. Hiroshi decided to move Nintendo's headquarters to the United States and established Nintendo of America with a team of 6 people. The US housed the largest arcades and gaming markets, which is why he made this decision. However, the game he sent to the US, Radarscope, was not well received. It was a dull airplane shooting game that failed to capture anyone's interest. As a result, Nintendo found itself in a major financial crisis, nearly on the verge of bankruptcy. Despite this failure, it would open the door to a new opportunity. A few years before this failure, in 1977, while constantly hiring engineers, Hiroshi couldn't turn down a request from a close friend to hire his friend's son, a fine arts graduate. However, he wasn't happy about it, as he needed engineers. He believed that someone with a fine arts degree had nothing to contribute to the company. The young man he hired was Shigeru Miyamoto. Born in 1952 in Sonobe, Japan, Miyamoto was a graduate of Kanazawa Municipal College of Arts and Crafts. He had an artistic personality and was a dreamer. Since childhood, he had a passion for comic books and loved adventure. Miyamoto wasn't afraid to criticize Nintendo from time to time. He could do so freely because his father was a close friend of Hiroshi's, so there was no risk to him. At this point, Miyamoto found it odd that Nintendo kept making violent, shoot-'em-up games. One day, while talking with Hiroshi, he shared these thoughts. In response, Hiroshi asked him to come up with a new design for Radarscope. However, the game was so bad that it couldn't be saved with a redesign, and it ended up where it belonged, in the trash. That's when Miyamoto decided to start working on an entirely new game concept. Miyamoto's initial idea was to use the character Popeye in the game, but due to copyright issues, he couldn't bring this idea to life. Then, the story of Beauty and the Beast came to mind, and he slowly began sketching his own monster. The result was a gorilla. Miyamoto liked this gorilla and quickly began writing a story for the game. However, Miyamoto just couldn't let go of Popeye. The story he wrote was inspired by the character. In the game, the gorilla would kidnap the girl, and the main hero would go on an adventure to rescue her. But for this, he needed a protagonist. Without wasting time, Miyamoto began designing the hero. Eventually, he came up with a stout character with a big nose wearing overalls. The story and characters were now ready. All that was left was to find a name for the game. Miyamoto picked up a Japanese-English dictionary and settled on the word donkey. For his gorilla, he took inspiration from King Kong and named him Kong. Finally, the name of the game was born, Donkey Kong. The game caused quite a stir within Nintendo. Many thought it was even worse than Radarscope, and according to the employees, bankruptcy was inevitable. This was the end. They would need to find new jobs. However, unlike everyone else, Hiroshi was quite pleased with the game. He believed Donkey Kong had a future. It was finally time to sell the game. Since the international market was also a target, the game was translated into English. The kidnapped girl was named after one of the office staff. However, there was still uncertainty about what to call the main hero. One of the employees suggested the name of the warehouse owner who had come to collect rent. His name was Mario Segale. Everyone loved the idea, and it was eventually decided that the main character would be named Mario. The game was released in 1981. In its first 2 years, it generated $280 million. Who could have imagined that after such a rise, the gaming industry would be on the verge of collapse? In 1982, with rapid technological advancements, the video game industry was very strong. Companies were no longer just focused on arcade games. They began developing consoles so people could play games at home. As a result, console companies like Atari started to grow. However, this success led to many other game companies entering the market. At that time, so many game consoles were being produced that companies abandoned quality and were racing to produce consoles faster. As a result, consumer trust in game consoles was broken, and no one wanted to buy them anymore. Console-producing companies started going bankrupt one by one. Even the industry leader, Atari, was affected and suffered a loss of $200 million in just 1 year. Hiroshi saw this collapse as an opportunity. In response, he released the new home console he had been working on, known as the Family Computer, or the Famicom. It was cheaper than traditional game consoles and came with entirely new scrolling styles and fresh games that felt different. The Famicom quickly became the most popular console in Japan. 1 in every 6 people in the country owned a Famicom. However, Hiroshi wanted to globalize, and he didn't care much about sales in Japan. He had one single dream: to become the leading console manufacturer overseas, especially in the United States. Most people thought it was a terrible time for Nintendo to enter the US console market. Trust in consoles had decreased, and people weren't buying them as they used to. The largest console manufacturer, Atari, had lost more than $600 million and was on the verge of bankruptcy. But to Hiroshi, this was an opportunity. Even though the Famicom was loved in Japan, Hiroshi thought the name should be changed before the US launch, and they renamed it the Nintendo Entertainment System, or as it's commonly known, the NES. Hiroshi believed that the failing game consoles had collapsed because their games weren't good enough. So before the launch, he decided that Nintendo needed to create games that people would love. That's when Nintendo decided to bring back Mario, who had been very popular in the Donkey Kong arcade game. They named the new game Super Mario. With the release of the console, Nintendo began to build its gaming empire on solid foundations. The NES was released in 1991 in America and in 1992 in Europe. The NES console had sold over 46 million units worldwide. In 1990, Nintendo didn't stop and launched a new portable console, the Game Boy. It meant that you could easily insert different game cartridges and carry many different games with you. The Game Boy needed an iconic game, just like Super Mario. And that game was Tetris. The game was so addictive that some players reported dreaming of falling blocks. This phenomenon was called the Tetris effect. The Game Boy sold twice as many units as the NES, and in the 90s, the names NES and Game Boy became well known to everyone. Of course, the secret to this success was also related to Nintendo's iconic characters. In the 90s, Nintendo controlled 90% of the gaming market, but a serious competitor began to rise: Sega. This marked the beginning of the legendary console wars. Sega's new console, the Genesis, or as it was known outside the US, the Mega Drive, was one of the first consoles to feature 16-bit technology instead of 8-bit. This meant it could offer better graphics and superior sound compared to the NES. To make matters worse for Nintendo, Sega decided to directly attack them in their advertisements. Nintendo marketed their consoles as family-friendly. Sega saw an opportunity in this and positioned the Genesis not only as a superior console to Nintendo's, but also as a more mature option. Sega's marketing campaign portrayed Nintendo as a toy for kids, while the Genesis was positioned as a cool console not just for children. In the 1990s, this created intense competition between the two companies. However, Sega realized something was missing. A mascot. Nintendo had the iconic Mario. While Sega had better graphics and sound, they didn't have a recognizable face for their brand. That's when an employee introduced a fast blue hedgehog who would later be known as Sonic. The character was a hit. Now the battle wasn't just Nintendo versus Sega, it was Mario versus Sonic. In response, Nintendo released the 16-bit SNES, a direct competitor to Sega's Genesis. After the launch of the SNES, Sega made a bold move by dropping the price of the Genesis from $190 to $140, making it $50 cheaper than Nintendo's console. Sega was betting that if they could sell more consoles, they would make more money in the long run by selling more games. However, despite Sega's efforts, Nintendo ultimately won the console war, thanks in part to the success of the Game Boy. Sega later released the Saturn and Dreamcast consoles, but they were poorly received by the market. However, just when Hiroshi thought the war was over, a much more dangerous competitor emerged: Sony. Nintendo and Sony had been collaborating on a console for years. However, in a public statement, Nintendo announced that they would no longer be working with Sony and would instead partner with Sony's biggest competitor, Philips. This was a public humiliation for Sony, and it made them furious. In response to this, Sony founded Sony Computer Entertainment and then launched the PlayStation. The PlayStation wasn't just a console with much better graphics, it also offered 3D capabilities and was more affordable. It made a huge impact on the market, and people couldn't believe the quality of the graphics. By parting ways with Sony, Nintendo had effectively dug its own grave. As Nintendo was trying to develop a console that could compete with the PlayStation, Sony suddenly released the PlayStation 2, delivering an even bigger blow to Nintendo. The PlayStation 2 remained on the market for 12 years and sold 155 million units worldwide, becoming the best-selling console of all time. In 2001, after Microsoft launched the Xbox, Nintendo found itself in a very difficult situation. The Xbox quickly became a massive hit as well. Nintendo's latest console, the GameCube, couldn't compete with Microsoft and Sony. After 53 years, Hiroshi decided to retire. Hiroshi was the man who transformed a playing card company in Japan into a global video game empire. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content and want to support me, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. See you in the next video.